Chapter 26, Adore Beauty, Despise Perfection. It felt as though a shadow was following Corey as he walked the short distance from Dorian's house into town. Maybe the dread was beginning to creep up on him in the form of a dark, foggy cloud that was now only millimeters away from pouncing, claiming him as its victim. That was, of course, the dread of seeing Arthur. He was scared about what he might do or say or imply. He was terrified, but maybe the metaphorical shadow following him wasn't dread. Maybe it was shame. The shame of what he had done the previous night. What he had done with Dorian, cooped up in Mrs. Wilson's study. He was ashamed that it had felt so good, guilty that he wanted to do it again, despite telling himself it was a mistake. They were meant to be taking things slow on not handing out handjobs the second they got a little tipsy. But maybe the shadow was merely his hangover, lurking stubbornly at the back of his head, squeezing his brain and slamming it against the inside of his skull. No amount of paracetamol could fix it. It was adamant on hanging around to worsen his mood to the point of misery. When he entered the small tea shop, the bell above the door chimed playfully and he groaned internally. He was in that all-too-familiar mood, the one where he felt so wretched and dreary that no one else was allowed to be happy, not even a bell. If the sun shined, he prayed for rain, and if a child laughed, he'd crave the sound of a sob ripping through the soul of a lonely person who had learnt the true realities of life. Arthur's dark eyes darted up as he entered, and a menacing smile tugged at his lips. A predatory expression crossed his features, but it was only seconds before his mask went straight back up. He smiled. "Heya, Corey. Just on time." Corey spared a glance at the pink clock in the corner. It was almost 7:30. He was 30 minutes late. "Hi. I'm just setting up. Come here, grab an apron." He gestured him over. Corey reached for one of the black aprons hanging on hooks behind the till, and slipped it over his head. "Here, let me help you with that," Arthur offered hastily. "No, it's okay. I think I've got Ida." He stopped dead, his words catching in his throat. Arthur was suddenly stood behind him, his whole body pressed flush against Corey's back. He grabbed the strings attached to the apron and pulled them tight around Corey's small waist, making him yelp in pain. And as if nothing had happened, Arthur was stood beside him again, smiling brightly. "Right, let me show you the ropes." Corey was on edge the whole day, flinching at the sound of Arthur's voice and trying not to stand too close to the older man. He quickly learned that working at a tea shop wasn't the most exciting job. They received few customers and everyone ordered the same thing. The only reason he wasn't bored out of his mind by 5 o'clock was because he had to remain alert every minute of the day, scared about what would happen if he let his guard down for even a second. Arthur would continuously make him feel uncomfortable, brushing past him, pressing up against him, touching him, murmuring in his ear, making inappropriate jokes that made Corey's skin crawl. Once they'd finished closing up, Corey discarded his apron, punched out and practically ran out the door, preparing for his 20-minute walk home. Dorian's house. It was funny how quickly things can change. How one minute it was the house of the boy he resented. It was just a place he was forced to visit to work on a project, and now it was his home. And Dorian wasn't the boy he thought he was. From day one, he knew Dorian was wearing a mask of sorts, something plastered over his face, over his entire identity. It concealed his secrets with false optimism and unfaltering smiles. It was impossible to be happy all the time, to not have anything to complain about. No one could do that, not even Dorian Price. And yet, Corey never once considered the possibility that Dorian's life may not be perfect. Chapter 27, 8. Dorian was laying wide awake in his mother's double bed. It had been a couple of weeks since he and Corey had started officially dating, although they had yet to properly define what they were. He didn't care what they were, as long as Corey was his. Labels didn't mean shit. He was struggling to sleep, tossing and turning and grunting in frustration. The sheets were tangled between his legs and his head buried between two fluffy pillows. He knew the reason for his insomnia: guilt. He hadn't been to see his mother once since she'd been in rehab. Corey had told him a million times that he shouldn't get wound up about it, but his words didn't ease Dorian's conscience. She didn't have the best parenting skills, but she was still his mother. She never spoke to him, she never cooked or cleaned for him, she never picked him up from school when he was little, she never drove him to play dates or went to his football games. She hadn't even called him since she'd been in hospital, and he knew for a fact that they had access to phones in there. She was never a mother. And yet, no matter how many times he tried to convince himself that her lack of interest in his life justified his failure to visit her, he just couldn't soothe his concerns. Dorian was Dorian. He lived for the sake of other people, and doing something so selfish just didn't sit right with him. He had to see her. He was stirred from his thoughts when the door gently creaked open. He squinted as light flooded into the shadowed room, seeping in from the hallway. "Corey?" He groaned tiredly. Corey was leant against the doorframe wearing one of Dorian's old jumpers, scratching his elbow awkwardly. "I can't sleep," he whispered into the darkness of the room. Dorian shifted and pulled the duvet back, signaling for him to get in. Corey quietly pressed the door shut and crawled into bed. "Thanks," he murmured. It was the first time they'd ever shared a bed, but neither of them were complaining. The second Corey slipped in, Dorian rolled over and pulled the smaller boy to his chest. He was done with being cautious and careful and anxious about moving too fast. If he wanted to cuddle Corey, he would. And if Corey didn't like it, he would tell him. "I can't sleep either," Dorian whispered in his ear, his nose buried in Corey's wild curls. "What are you thinking about?" He replied softly, burrowing into Dorian's side, searching for warmth and affection. "My mum," he sighed. "You?" "My dad. I'm sorry." Corey didn't reply, just rested his head on Dorian's built chest, mindlessly interweaving his legs with his. "I think I'm gonna see my mum tomorrow. Do you want me to come?" "Yes, but no," Dorian replied honestly. "I want you to be there, but I don't want to put you through any more shit. The last time you came to the hospital with me, you had a panic attack?" Corey supplied. "It's okay, you can say it." Dorian tightened his grip on the boy. "Yeah," he whispered back. "You're right, it's probably a good idea that I don't go." Corey agreed reluctantly. He wanted to be there for Dorian, but his body wouldn't let him. "Hospitals remind me of my mum." Dorian's fascination peaked. Corey rarely talked about his mother. All he knew was that she died when he was 8. He didn't even know what of. "Do you mind if I Ashka? She killed herself." The words were sharp as a blade, cutting into flesh and tearing it apart. Dorian's heart clenched and his pity for the boy curled up at his side only grew. "Shit, babe, I'm so please don't. I can't stand people feeling sorry for me." In any other situation, Dorian would have rolled his eyes. "Corey, it's okay to feel she overdosed." "That was the next question you were too scared to ask, right?" Corey sighed, his voice as fragile as glass and as quiet as a half-forgotten memory. "My dad always talked about it like it was an accident, but I know it was suicide. She was a coward like that, always taking the easy way out. She could have gotten away from him." Chapter 28, A Thing. When Corey first awoke that morning, he was struck with a pang of confusion. It took him a moment to gain a real understanding of his surroundings, and memories of the previous night came flooding back to him. The sheets he was cuddling were foreign, but the smell couldn't be more familiar. Dorian's cologne. He'd spent the night with him. The thin blinds were drawn shut and sunshine soaked through the cheap material, falling over his face and the dusty carpeted floor. The musty scent of the room hit him like a wave of nostalgia. The stale carpet and moldy wallpaper reminded him of visits to his grandma's house when he was a little boy. His mother would send him there some weekends, force him out of the house so he couldn't watch his violent dad beating her every night. His grandma died when he was just 6 years old. He didn't think about her much, but this room reminded him of her, or the smell did at least. He loved his grandma. She spoiled him rotten. Every time he visited, she'd take him to the shop down the road and let him pick out as many sweets as he wished. She used to drive him to the seaside and he'd roll his window down, letting the salty breeze ruffle his hair and sting his rosy cheeks. The beach was their thing, and no matter what time of year it was, they'd buy an ice cream and eat it in front of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks. His memories of his grandma were only sweet, rock candy sticks, licking the spoon after baking cookies, reheated baked beans and watching daytime television in her cold living room. And then he'd return to his own house, his own life. His father would scream at him, his mother would cry in the corner. He'd get a slap and no dinner. Sent to his room at 6 p.m., the door locked and window shut. Suddenly, the bedroom door opened and Dorian appeared, his face tinted pink from the winter's bite, dressed in his coat and boots. "You still in bed?" he asked in exasperation. Corey studied his appearance and frowned. "Are you going out?" "I just got back. It's 1 o'clock, babe." Corey glanced at the digital clock on the bedside table and realized that he was telling the truth. "Shit," he breathed. "Where did you go?" "To see my mum." His words held weight and his expression fell as he sat on the end of the bed. "How was she?" He shrugged. Well, she definitely hasn't changed. She's the same as ever. I'm sorry. Nah, it's okay. Dorian tousled Corey's hair playfully. You ready to go? Go where? Dorian laughed. Have you seriously only just woken up? Yeah. He yawned. I was really tired. I can tell. Dorian grabbed Corey's phone from the nightstand and handed it to him. Check your messages. Corey's emerald eyes scanned the screen as he scrolled through his notifications. We're going to Ty's house? Yeah, he's having a thing. A thing? A thing? What do you mean a thing? You know, a thing. Dorian laughed. A get-together. Not huge. Just us, Velvet, a few of the guys from the team. Micah will probably be there. Corey took his sweet time getting ready. He had a long cold shower and brushed his teeth for at least 10 minutes before pulling on his clothes. He skipped breakfast, pulled an orange beanie over his head and told Dorian he was ready to leave. They hopped onto his bike and within 20 minutes, they were there. Corey had never been to Ty's house before. He wasn't sure what to expect. When they pulled up outside, he took it all in. The cobbled pathway was woven with thin ropes of ivy snaking between the stones, and the grass was greener than any he'd ever seen. It was clear that Ty's parents had a passion for gardening. The lawn was perfectly well kept and pretty flowers lined the perimeter. The outside of the house was impressive yet modest at the same time. The bricks were aligned symmetrically and the door painted a pure, cold black color. After knocking twice, Ty answered the door with a wide smile. What took you so long? He asked frustratedly, but his grin told them